And it is a great mistake, I think, to assume because a country hasn't got democracy that it doesn't want democracy. Because it's trying to find democracy, we should do everything we possibly can to support and help them get closer to that goal which every single human being wants and not many enough get. I worked hard also and in a different angle for about 7 years on Romania's accession to the European Union. And we found the rapporteurships were very helpful indeed in terms of assisting basically the Commission in its very difficult task of building societies out of the smouldering heaps of the collapse of communism. Romania, of course, had a particularly difficult history with Ceausescu, a really monstrously difficult history. And to be under the heel of such a dictator who deliberately starved you, who deliberately forced women to have no less than 5 children plus, and then the poor women couldn't look after them, so they all went into orphanages. The cruelty was very profound indeed. And I remember talking to the former Speaker of the House of Commons, who then went into the Lords, and I asked him, because he was sent over by Mrs. Thatcher, because we were so worried about Romania in the early 1980s, and he told me that he'd been to see Mr. Ceausescu at Mrs. Thatcher's command, and that Mr. Ceausescu had said to him, "Oh no, everything's absolutely fine. I'm just about to go over to my own constituency and open a supermarket, for example. You must come with me. You see, the population isn't starving at all." And so they got in a vehicle and they went to the constituency, and there was a huge supermarket with the shelves absolutely laden with food. And Mr. Ceausescu opened the supermarket, and there were plenty of bands and applause and all the rest of it. And my colleague, who was the Member of Parliament, Bernard Wetherill, he went round the back. He slipped away and went round the back. And there at the back, he saw all the lorries, and the men were already from the back unloading all the food that had been on the shelves on the supermarket and driving it all away again. The whole thing was a farce, and that cruelty permeated the whole of society. I felt strongly, and it was a good feeling, I think, according to my colleagues, that it wasn't possible for Romania to enter the European Union until she had passed really the Copenhagen criteria, which had not happened with regard to children. Hundreds of thousands of children had been wrecked by Ceausescu's policy, and there were 613 of these enormous orphanages, monstrous places. And so I settled down to work on that, and discovered very quickly that the reason so late on, after Ceausescu had been killed, this was a decade later, in 1999-2000, why those children were there, I couldn't think why, because huge sums of money had poured in. Indeed, the Financial Times local man told me, who was an Irishman, and he and his wife were very upset, and they'd analysed the whole thing, and it would appear that Romania had received $1 billion for these children, and in fact that it was the highest overseas earner, the children's orphanages, of any. I couldn't think why those orphanages should still be there. And sort of looking around a bit, it became painfully clear why they were still there. It's because they were being used as supermarkets for children. They were being trafficked. And when I looked further into the figures, I saw that even the government admitted to me that 30,000 children had totally disappeared overseas over a decade since Ceausescu had died. And they just couldn't trace them. There was no wish to trace them. There were no names. There was nothing at all. They were just numbers with no papers, numbers on a computer. So it was clear that the thing we had to do was to change the law. And there is a common belief among many people that if you put a law in a country that's very difficult, the law won't be implemented, and therefore it's a pointless thing to do. Dear colleagues and friends, it's an incredibly powerful tool. If you have no law, you have nothing to go to. If you have a law, you can put people's behaviour against that law. All right, you may have corrupt judges, you may have a corrupt judiciary, you may have rotten attorneys, you may have a ridiculous system which doesn't actually give justice at all. But if you have the law, you've got the beginning of truth and reality. So with the Commission and with the Council of Ministers, we all channeled the same desire. We worked very hard. I uncovered the early law, which was still in progress. It was still there in 1954 law, called the Family Law, and that gave the government, the state, parental rights on any live birth. So there you are. That's how they could be sold and taken from the parents. So there was no parental rights at all. They were owned by the state. So we made a massive effort. And I have to tell you, it wasn't easy. The reason it wasn't easy is because it's not in the acquis communautaire. There's nothing in the acquis communautaire on children. That's a national problem. That's a national responsibility, because normally countries would have come through the Copenhagen criteria, which would deal with that. So it was very difficult indeed to actually have any justification for doing this work. And that's where Gunther Verheugen was so helpful. He was, as you know, the commissioner in charge of enlargement. So we made great friends. And I also got Elmar Brock, my chairman. I was the vice chairman, and Elmar was sickened when he heard about all of this. So somehow it was really, it was basically Germany and Britain. And then we pulled in the best of the Italian MEPs and the Spanish MEPs, and we all blocked together, and we worked very hard indeed, and we got the perfect child protection law in, which reflects the Declaration of the Rights of the Child. And to show you how distorted people's attitudes become when they've come out of a dictatorship, the Declaration of the Rights of the Child, United Nations Declaration of the Rights of the Child, I was told was already incorporated. It was already in the law. It was in the Constitution. So reading the Constitution in Romanian, the issue became clear. It had been filleted, and it had been changed, and a bastard version of the UN Declaration had been put into the Constitution, which enabled the government to go on selling children. The aftermath of communism, therefore, has wrecked generations of people, and our biggest enemy, of course, was then communism. And I'm very proud and happy that so many Eastern European nations have joined the European Union, because that is the buffer against a regression into a cruel communist dictatorship again. And you've only to look down the road and look at poor Moldova, look further down the road and look at Russia and see Ukraine in the middle, and you can tell what I mean. Even though it's difficult, even though Bulgaria is very corrupt, more corrupt than Romania, even though some other nations are not as clean as they should be in the European Union, this is the important place to get them into. And I'm very happy indeed that the Helsinki process of enlargement of 1999, that vote, I'm very happy that that went through, and very happy indeed that we managed to use it successfully for two magnificent enlargements. So one of the biggest tools, I think, for nation building is the very careful and gentle but quite firm enlargement process of the European Union. It was a particular joy to be able to be part of that. Another tool which was so very helpful, as you have also mentioned already, is election monitoring. I did a great deal of that. Perhaps one of the most interesting ones was in Yemen, where I was the chief election observer twice. The second time I was the only observer. No one else had gone at all. But the first time we had about 130 strong team, and we were able to go over the whole country. It wasn't very easy, but the electorate really wanted their vote. And that's the excitement of monitoring election, knowing that at last the population has been given their chance to change their leaders. But I say it wasn't very easy in Yemen. I remember as chief election monitor being summoned to one of the biggest cities, which was halfway up a mountain, where the opposition wanted to lodge a complaint against the government. And so I said, well, what's the complaint? And I walked into this room, and both the opposition and the government locally were around the same table, glaring at each other. I said, oh dear, I'm so sorry, what's the problem? And the opposition rather nervously said, well, the government keeps shooting our gatherings, and they keep killing our supporters. Oh dear, I said, I'm so sorry, how does this happen?